the conservative democracy, which is based on the strict father model. And in this frame, so when this frame is activated, it brings up the idea of authority being the highest moral authority. And that authority figure defines right or wrong and rules through punishment. So how do you decide who the authority figure is? It's based on a hierarchy. For example, you have God over man, man over woman, man over nature, whites over non-whites, rich over poor. You get the idea. And that is who the authority figure is. And that authority figure rules through punishment. And why punishment? Because one can only be successful if one is disciplined. And self-discipline is required to make someone moral. So if you do the logical extension of this, therefore the authority figure is the most moral because they've been the most successful, so therefore they must be the most disciplined. Makes sense. So unlike in the progressive frame where you have empathy, responsibility for others, in the conservative frame you have responsibility for yourself alone. Very important. And what is the definition of democracy? It provides maximum liberty to seek one's own self-interest without the responsibility for others. That's critically important. You can look at every conservative policy and it translates directly to this idea of providing maximum liberty to seek one's own self-interest. And yes, that can mean profit and accumulation of wealth. So success comes from self-discipline. Lack of success implies lack of morality. And the public is immoral. Why is the public immoral? Because it takes away those incentives for personal and private success through regulation, taxes, things like that. And conservatives conceal this fundamental truth that progressives acknowledge, and that is that the private depends on the public. Why do they conceal it? Because in order for their frame to function, that has to be true. And since the frame is a physical system of neural circuitry in the brain, the preservation of that system is the highest priority that the brain makes when you are in that frame, in that system. So that is a place where conservatives are vulnerable. This idea that the private depends on the public. So here's a perfect example of that. This is a Scott Walker interview with the Young Americas Foundation. I'm going to switch over to the video here.
You could give that speech today, not tell people who it was, just play it, play the audio of that, and I think people would find it just as compelling today as it was the day he gave it. And there's a difference between right and left, and it's not one side or the other, it's whether we're going upward and forward, or whether we're going down and backwards. And I hope people will relook at those incredible words over and over again as we celebrate the 50th anniversary. People like President Obama and his allies tended to measure success in government by how many people were dependent on the government, by how many people were on Medicaid and food stamps and unemployment. That we instead, we as conservatives, should measure success in government by just the opposite, by how many people are no longer dependent.
So did you catch that? The idea that measure success by not how many people are dependent on government, but how many are not dependent, independent. The other thing he did at the beginning that was really important was he evoked a metaphor for forward progress. He said that it's not the conservative and liberal are different because it's a matter of conservatives taking people forward, not backwards, and going up and not down. So he created metaphor for the differences between the two. Well, in his mind, moral. Some people would interpret it as partisan, but it's clearly moral with Scott Walker and most conservatives. So here are some critical concepts that progressives have failed to practice. Now that you have a little bit of background in the frames, that conservatives do well, and actually, in fact, are basically marketing and ideas based in cognitive science, how people understand the world. We talked about this, just the facts doesn't win votes. I was astounded that after the last governor's election, that there were a lot of people that I have a great deal of respect for, I like and talk to all the time, who said if we just need to get the facts out more about how terrible Scott Walker is, about all the things he's not doing. I can guarantee you there were very few voters in Wisconsin that did not know that Scott Walker had not met his job goal. And yet it didn't matter. Why is that? Because all politics are moral. Politicians create policy because they believe they're morally right. And those policies, whether you are conservative or progressive, are based on your values. So you need to provide context for those facts within your frame so that people understand the facts and why they are important in terms of your frame, not your opponent's. And this is not propaganda. This is not spin. This must be authentic. It must be honest. And as I said, this is to provide a frame in order for the truth to be accepted. Otherwise, people won't hear the truths that you're trying to tell them. Here's a perfect example of that. You all remember this 10 days of early voting, 10 reasons to vote against Scott Walker, right? How many of you remember, other than this one, any of the other reasons to vote against Scott Walker? Guessing none, because I don't. So here's something interesting as well. We talk about centrists and moderates, how we have to get the moderate vote. Well, there's really no such thing as a centrist or moderate. There's no ideology of the center. There's no moral frame for the moderate. What people are biconceptual. I guarantee you virtually every one of you sitting there today are part progressive and part conservative. If you can watch a John Wayne movie and understand the plot and understand the message, you are part conservative. Most conservatives have the capacity for empathy. They do things for others. They generally care for others, whether it's immediate family, friends. They care for those people, and in times of crisis will take responsibility for those people. So this is important because what we know about framing tells us that when you address people who are biconceptual, which is 70–75% of the population, when you address them in their progressive frames, it will activate the progressive frames in their brain, which will reinforce them, make them more expedient, such as the interstate highway, because every time people think, they frame. So for example, George Lakoff wrote a book, very famous book, Don't Think of an Elephant. You know, what's important about that? First of all, it demonstrates why negation is so unsuccessful. If I tell you don't think of an elephant, you're all thinking of an elephant. The other thing that it does is you now frame that sentence through neural binding to activate all sorts of thoughts and emotions about an elephant. And you do it unconsciously. So what we're going to do is consciously choose frames through effective language to effectively communicate our progressive ideas. So the next video is a great example of saying what you believe in the progressive frame. This is Melissa Sargent, who's a state rep from Madison, and she is going to talk about we need to get rid of him. So she's going to talk about education.
Hi, State Representative Melissa Sargent here. I'm just returning from school visits. I visited 3 schools today, and I think that brings us up to about 10 schools visited since just this last couple of months. And what I'm seeing in our public schools here in Madison are children who are learning, children who are part of a community, children who feel
Scott,
safe.
can you hear us? We can hear us.
And I see
Hold on. Let me turn the volume up here. Hold on.
Okay.
You may have it is a little bit of a quiet video, so see if this works better.
Representative Melissa Sargent. I'm just returning from school visits. I visited 3 schools today, and I think that brings us up to about 10 schools visited since just this last couple of months. And what I'm seeing in our public schools here in Madison are children who are learning, children who are part of a community, children who feel safe and are taking care of one another. And I see teachers.
Yeah,
Could you hear that, Mary?
No, it did not work well. We were getting we could not hear her well, and then we were getting feedback, I think, on our speakers or your speakers. I'm not sure.
Hold on, let me try to.
State Representative Melissa Sargent here. I'm just returning from school visits. I visited 3 schools today, and I think that brings us up to about 10 schools visited since just this last couple of months. And what I'm seeing in our public schools here in Madison are children who are learning, children who are part of a community, children who feel safe and are taking care of one another. And I see teachers who are educating our kids, who are making community, who are investing in our future. The people.
Yes, that was better. Yes, that was better.
Good. Okay. But did you all get that in terms of talking about education as community and making, kids are safe, they're part of the community, the teachers are helping create community by investing in our students. So she's evoking this idea of not only empathy, but taking responsibility, and that's something that is done in the community, and then it makes for a healthy community. Get to more of that later. So some takeaways from all this is that one of the keys to doing effective messaging in terms of framing and values messaging is to understand the difference between moral and partisan. You all know that there are Democrats who have conservative values and that there are Republicans who have some progressive values. Not so many, but they are there. But to understand the difference between moral and partisan on issues and identify that moral frame, then find out where biconceptuals are on those issues. And education is a great one because there are so many rural conservatives that care very deeply about their community schools. And they're biconceptually progressive on education. So if you speak to them about education in the progressive frame, you can then use that same language on other issues to continue evoking the progressive frame and reinforcing it, beginning with something they believe, and then bringing them over and reinforcing the progressive frame on other issues. And that helps us avoid issue silos and creates kind of unity and collaboration across issues. So I'm sure a lot of you are feeling a little, wow, what are we going to do? This seems hopeless. The conservatives are so dominant. But I want to bring you a message of hope. And that is that there's hope in all of us. Because we all evolve for empathy. It is part of our DNA. It is how our brains evolved. And you understand that because you unconsciously seek a connection with others in the world. There was an amazing discovery by Antonio Damasio, who's an Italian neuroscientist, who discovered mirror neurons. And mirror neurons are present in all of us. They're present in virtually every mammal on Earth. And it allows us to experience the activation of the same neurons watching an activity, watching somebody do something or experience something, as actually doing that activity ourselves. So if you were all sitting there watching me on the big screen, and somebody came and poured an ice cold bucket of water over my head, the same neurons would fire in your brain, creating an unconscious and somewhat conscious reaction to watching that happen as me experiencing it. Which is why we all love cute puppy stories, why we all love watching kids open birthday presents, why we all experience pain when we see somebody else experience pain or suffering. We evolve for empathy. The problem is that's been suppressed by the conservative self-interest frame dominance. And all we need to do is start strengthening it through effective framing, to start evoking empathy and start exercising the neural circuitry for empathy through the progressive frame. And it can happen very quickly, too. I have an example of that coming up. So now we're going to have some fun. By now, I'm sure many of you have heard a lot of pundits, talking heads, except for me, talking about the 2014 election and what happened and where do we go from here. And I'm going to, tonight, present to you the theory that based on what the Mary Burke and Scott Walker visions were, as presented in their campaigns, that Mary Burke could not have possibly won. And you're going to see why in a moment. First, I want to take an informal poll. Whose vision of Wisconsin is this? This is directly from the election. Wisconsin with a leading economy, leader in the Midwest, top 10 in the nation, education system producing graduates who have skills and education to compete in the workforce, state that's found ways to balance job creation with protecting natural resources, especially like agriculture and mining. Who do you think that was? Is there a consensus?
Yes. Can you hear us? Yes. Can you hear us?
Oh, I can. Yes. Yep.
Mary Burke. Mary Burke. Right? Is that our consensus?
Are you sure?
Are you sure? Are you sure? Well, now we're thinking more Walker.
Okay. Well, I'll reveal towards the end of this section, but think about it a little more as we go here. So I'm just going to play. It's very brief. I'm sure you all saw it, but in this context, you're going to see it differently. This is the first Walker campaign ad. And understand that the pain frame is set by the first actions and messages of the campaign very intentionally. So here is the first campaign ad.
It had gotten pretty bad 4 years ago. Over 130,000 jobs lost. A deficit over $3 billion. And taxes going up. Wisconsin's future looked dark. But it's different now. Wisconsin is turned around. The deficit is gone. Taxes are lower. And more people have gone back to work. Kids are going to college. Families are planning vacations. And more are going to sleep knowing they have access to health care. Unemployment is below the national average, and we're investing in worker training to prepare people for the jobs that are available. The goal is that everyone who wants a job can find a job. Less dependence on government, more dependence on individual hard work and pride. That's progress. That's what leadership feels like. And thanks to Governor Walker, Wisconsin is back on.
I hear some comments.
Comments?
So how about that?
You could. One comment, it's a lie.
Well, yeah, that's so. But let's look at that for a second. First of all, there's a lot of metaphor in imagery going on there. The dark versus the light. But the key phrases there are right in front of you. The goal is that everyone who wants a job can find a job, meaning, now think of this in terms of what you learned about the conservative frame. If somebody can't find a job, what does that mean? They're not disciplined enough, right? So they deserve their joblessness, they deserve their poverty. That is punishment for being not disciplined and immoral. Critically important. That's why the whole job creation thing is so critical to the conservative frame. And then, of course, you saw this earlier in his victory speech. Less dependence on government, more dependence on what? Individual hard work and pride. All these things like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, work hard, take pride. Those are all defined metaphors by this idea of less dependence on government, more self-interest, pursuit of your own self-interest, and individual hard work to define success. So, specifically, how does that evoke the conservative frame? Some really important points here. First of all, you probably understand this instinctively because I'm guessing most of you have a very visceral reaction when you see Scott Walker. Right? I mean, if you had all just eaten, you would have a nauseated feeling. Why is that? It's because Scott Walker has become the embodiment of the strict authoritarian father. And that is the contrary moral worldview that all of you have. So think in terms of that this is how you feel seeing Scott Walker is the same feeling that conservatives have when they look at Tammy Baldwin, Barack Obama, Mark Pocan, etc., etc. Okay? That physical embodiment is important because remember, everything you understand is physically in your brain. So that physical connection, positive or negative, is critically important. Okay. The public is immoral and it takes away incentives to private success. That's foundational to everything that Scott Walker says and does. The private sector is the only sector that has the moral right to create jobs. The public gets in the way. Okay? Also critically important. Talked about this before. Those who do not have jobs are undisciplined and immoral. They deserve their unemployment. They deserve poverty. More importantly, Scott Walker is the moral conservative leader. So when you think of it in terms of that, every time you say his name, you're reinforcing that entire frame. So just a quick review of how this relates to issues, right? In terms of economics, Tax and spend plans that increase voter red tape and make it harder to create jobs, right? Government gets in the way. Government is immoral. This idea of your tax burden has dropped and more jobs have been created. Taxes are a burden in the conservative frame. That's why you need tax relief, to relieve that unjust, immoral burden so that the private sector can create jobs. See, great metaphorical imagery there. Education. We're seeing this, we saw this play out in joint finance, and it's critically important, right? This idea that schools fail, leaving students behind, right, is this idea of direct causation, right? Conservatives love direct causation, right? Kids aren't doing well in school because schools are failing and teachers are terrible and unions protect bad teachers, right? So privatize the school, get rid of the teachers' unions, and kids will do better. Now, whether the facts support that is irrelevant, because in their frame, this is a moral issue. Okay? Critically important. The whole idea of transparency and accountability in terms of education reforms are for punishment. Okay? Accountability, excuse me, is nothing more than how to gauge who and what should be punished. For example, this idea that schools that fail to meet expectations should be closed and turned into charter schools or private schools, right? Accountability. So when conservatives talk about accountability, they mean punishment. And then we talked about the idea of career ready being a metaphor and code in conservative language for education is to get a job. Serves no other function but to make sure that kids can get a job because it provides them with discipline. Healthcare. We've seen healthcare has turned into being understood in terms of the market. So conservatives and public discourse is always about healthcare costs and family and employer budgets and eliminating red tape because bureaucratic red tape increased costs. Now we know it doesn't, right? Factually, that's not true. But in terms of, again, their moral frame and their moral certitude on this issue, it's consistent with what they believe. And the idea of giving families more control of their health care is, again, evoking this idea of control in terms of the authoritarian figure, in the family having control, the strict father having control. Not in terms of mutual responsibility or community or empathy, but individual control. Of course, in the marketplace as well. So now let's look at the Burke campaign. Many of you would have seen this, and this is her
in this small
video.
bar that my father had a big idea. Trek bicycle. I'm Mary Burke, and I'm proud to have helped build Trek into a great Wisconsin company where nearly 1,000 people go to work every day. But I also know that for too many, the economy isn't working as it should. Good jobs like Trek's are hard to find, and it's a struggle paying the bills or saving a little. That's why I'm running for governor, because we can do better. Instead of the petty politics that make Madison a battleground, I'll work every day to bring people together like I did. Instead of more cuts to education, I'll make sure our kids have the skills and training they need to succeed. That's what the program I started is doing for hundreds of students every day. And instead of more breaks for big money special interests, I'll work for families like yours. Because you deserve a governor who puts you first. And that's what I'll do every day.
Okay, so most of you have seen that ad, not in this context. But let's look at it not in terms of Mary Burke. I think Mary Burke is a very nice person, very successful. That's fantastic. But let's look at it in terms of campaign strategy and messaging, which is what we need to do. First of all, the idea that her father had a big idea to trek bicycle. Okay, we could contrast that with Tammy Baldwin, who credited her upbringing to both of her grandparents. Right, the idea of having nurturing parents, both a mother and father, or two fathers, two mothers, whatever family unit it is, it's nurturing. Everybody has responsibility for each other, as opposed to the idea of a father having this big idea for a private company that provided the financial means for the family. Really important contrast there. Again, a lot of focus on the private sector here, really highlighting the idea of job creation in the private sector. In terms of education, kids having the skills and training they need to succeed. Very similar to the career-ready idea, and also this idea of big money special interests. Progressives use it all the time, but unfortunately, in terms of common sense, special interests in terms of common sense and public discourse mean labor unions, primarily. And it's very much unconsciously understood that way. So, not very strongly evocative of the progressive perspective. Let's look at some issues on this quickly here. So, the economy, opening up new global markets, creating good jobs. Private sector approach as Secretary of the Department of Commerce, right? Putting the private sector above the public, and in fact focusing on the idea of job creation in the private sector, evoking the conservative frame. Education, offering a way up to a good job, key to a strong economy, right? This one I found really interesting, linguistically and cognitively, knowing that every Wisconsin student prepared to work hard can realize their dreams. So what does that say about kids who are not realizing their dreams? They're not working hard. They're not working hard enough. Right? That idea of if you are moral and disciplined and you want a job, you'll find a job. Very interesting. And then talking about accountability measures, private schools, it doesn't matter if you're talking about the specific detail of private schools taking public dollars, right? You're evoking this whole idea of accountability. Critically important. And then healthcare. We've come into this time based on the Affordable Care Act and the Supreme Court decisions upholding the Affordable Care Act, where healthcare in this country is codified as a function of the market, function of economics, not in terms of something critical to freedom, critically, fundamentally necessary for life, right? So what is the message on healthcare? Smart, fiscally responsible ways families getting the health coverage they need. Affordable and accessible, and then evoking the idea of the Walker administration taking a different approach, right? But if you look back at what healthcare was very similar. Setting aside details of whether you accept Medicaid money or not, the overall frame being evoked, which is how people vote, is very similar. So whose vision was that up above? That was the Burke campaign. And maybe some of you saw and gave it away, but seeing this, if you have a governor's race where you have a question on a statement of who that is and what their moral position is based on this idea of framing, that could be a problem. So that's something that we really need to work on in terms of not only candidates, but everyone in every county, making sure that things are framed properly, and then we start evoking progressive ideas and forwarding progressive vision. So I'm going to upgrade Mary here as a presenter. so we can have some interaction as we, let's see, I'm activating your stuff now, Mary. Oh, and there's that. Yes. Hey, there's everybody. You get your voice. Oh, what happened? There we go. There we go. Okay, I can see you.
We can't see you. Is that all right?
You can't see me?
Can't, but hang on.
Oh. I know why.
I just
Hold
took
on.
it off the big screen so we can see you.
Good afternoon. Appreciate the opportunity to give you an update as to what's going on, or in this case, in some cases, not going on in the state capitol. First off, I want to begin certainly acknowledging the thousands of people who are outside protesting, many of whom are from the state of Wisconsin. Many more lately have been coming in from other parts across the country. Certainly acknowledge their right to be heard, but I particularly want to thank the 300,000 plus state and local workers from across Wisconsin who, unlike those here today, didn't skip out on work, showed up for their jobs, did their jobs the way that they have done in the past, and I believe will do in the future, and that is be good professional public servants, and we appreciate the work that they continue to do.
Wisconsin's always been a place of big ideas. Our next one? Right to work. Right to work means more freedom. It means more choices for Wisconsin's workers. Because deciding to join the union should be your choice, not theirs. And deciding not to join shouldn't cost you your job. Right to work means more jobs for Wisconsin. It means making Wisconsin a better place for new businesses. So tell your legislator, right to work is right for Wisconsin.
Freshman Senator Ron Johnson has only been in office 4 months, and he's already making a big impact, taking on the budget and the deficit, and being talked about as a candidate for vice president. Senator Johnson is here with us now, sir. Thank you very much. Big issue coming up very soon, within days, I guess, the debt ceiling. The vote is just days away. What will you do when asked to raise the debt ceiling, and why?
Well, hello, Eric. Thanks for having me on. I think the vote on the debt ceiling is a very important moment in time where we can really expose who's serious about actually controlling spending and who isn't. So I think we need to utilize that moment as of maximum leverage to extract the strongest possible spending controls. Because in the end, that's our problem. We have a spending problem. And really, the way, as a manufacturer, I always look to the root cause of the problem. And to me, the root cause of our problems right now is the size, the scope. That includes regulation and the cost of government. And I think what we first need to do is establish a very hard spending cap. And that's what we need to attach to that debt ceiling vote.